Hello. I have to get used to this. Hello, everybody. Welcome to what is our last public lecture of the semester. Thank you to the departments and the programs that have contributed a very lively and free-ranging set of presentations over these last weeks. This is just what the lecture program at Cranbrook should be. And tonight's lecture is cross-listed with the University of Detroit Mercy, so it's good to see folks from UDM here. Thanks for coming. Tonight, I'm very happy to introduce to you Etienne Turpin, who will not only be talking to us tonight, but also meeting with many second-year students over the coming days as a guest reviewer. We're lucky to have him at Cranbrook for almost a full week of conversation with students. Etienne is visiting from just a short ways away. He is both a research fellow for the Center of Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Michigan, as well as a lecturer in the Tubman College of Architecture and Urban Design. Etienne's work and research are far-ranging, from considering climate change on urban settlements and the resulting possibilities for design responses to his current work on the Anthropocene from a geologic point of view and its effects on architecture and design. These research projects are part of a larger study of the relations among architecture, philosophy, and geology, entitled Terrible is the Earth, a manuscript now in production. Last year, as Tubman College's Walter Sanders Fellow, Etienne organized and curated the Geologic Turn, a symposium at the University of Michigan. He is now editing the proceedings from his symposium for the book Architecture in the Anthropocene, Encounters Among Design, Deep Time, Science, and Philosophy. Also during the Sanders Fellowship, Etienne developed the exhibition Stainlessness, which considered the iconography of steel in North American architecture, urbanism, and consumerism at the end of the 19th century. And as you can imagine, featured Detroit centrally. Etienne's own background is in philosophy and humanities with degrees from the University of Ottawa and the University of Toronto, where he earned his PhD. In addition to philosophy, his teaching and research areas include architecture theory, design research, political economies of land use and resource extraction, aesthetics, modern and contemporary art, contemporary philosophy and philosophy of nature, and post-industrial environments of desolation. As I said, far-ranging. Happily, we'll have a chance to learn more about these subjects in February, when Etienne will be back to Cranbrook for a workshop with students. But for now, we're very happy to hear from him tonight and to have him for the coming week of reviews. Etienne, welcome.
Thank you for the introduction. I must sound like a very confused person when I hear people say what I'm working on. And thank you to Sarah Turner for organizing everything in the Cranbrook Academy of Art, the Critical Studies program, and the University of Detroit Mercy School of Architecture who sponsored the lecture. So tonight I'm going to try to tell a story about rocks and painted rocks and contemporary geology and prehistoric art. So we have a lot to talk about, and I'm going to try to do it on time. But as the first of probably several disclosures, I just want to say, as you just heard, that my background is in philosophy, and I have a bit of a philosophical bone to pick in this talk that is sort of underneath, so I just put it on the table that a lot of people recently, theorists we call them, or critics, have been talking about things like thing power and something called object-oriented ontology, which is the thingness, the existence of things. And so things have been kind of hot lately, if we can say. You know, I can't be the only one to notice. People just love talking about things all of a sudden. And so I find this really bizarre because it's exactly at the moment when we have like a irrefutable evidence of anthropogenic climate change, whether we look at Sandy or the Philippines even more recently, that at that moment, people in theory say, let's just look at like really banal objects. And so I don't really have an explanation for why that's happening. I don't have a theory of things yet, but maybe as part of the lecture, we can try to work out a bit of that and talk about it in the discussion. But the primary activity of the lecture will be that I will recount for you a parable of the Cherokee artist Jimmy Durham and his residency in the prehistoric caves of Lascaux. The parable will shape our inquiry into the role of human agency, human art, and the feelings that I hope some of us at least share of paralysis that is conjured forth by a world of irreversible anthropogenic reformation. Jimmy Durham's lesson, if it is in fact one that we can share, is that the value of our attention to things or objects, to their powers and their orientations, and to their transient and shifting meanings, is an especially human endeavor, indelibly entangled within the history of cultural politics. But before we start on all of this parable business with Jimmy Durham, we have to begin at the beginning with Michel Serres and ask why tigers piss at the edge of their caves. So this is from the Shenzhen Zoo. It's a real photograph. And that it's a photograph that I found on the internet. In a recent book, a very small, hurried little book called Malfeasance, the French philosopher of science Michel Serres questions the relationship between two things, appropriation and filth. For Serres, he says, quote, "The science of animal behavior," which is called ethology, "describes at length those nests, holes, wallows, sheds, ecological niches, in short, how males define and defend their habitats with their filth. These places are often secret, hidden, dark, buried, lost places where the living eat, sleep, hibernate, copulate, give birth, and are born, in short, where they survive. Do they own or rent these places?" End quote. The answer is delivered by way of Serres' extension of the question of filth to the question of pollution, but also through his insistence on the common bodily origins of pollution. In his words, appropriation takes place through dirt because bodily discharges, that is, urine, manure, or corpses, but sperm as well, were used to appropriate places. Following his consideration of a series of exemplary appropriating emissions from those left in bedroom sheets to those left in cemeteries, Serres arrives at the following summary, and I'll just quote this to get Serres through to the tigers. "The increasing volume of trash or excretions, urine, sperm, blood, corpses, that still bodily or physiological excretions mark the extension of expropriated space, nest, farm, city, country, and also the increase in the number of subjects of appropriation, individual, family, nation. For the rhythm of this increase to stop and then suddenly change into a vertical spurt engulfing the planet and humanity, it had to go from cemeteries or bodily excretions, subjective or human, to more objective trash. Sewage farms, public dumps, in big cities, industrial waste that is less biodegradable, or world objects in the world. We have now arrived." End quote. This is an image of Detroit from a hot air balloon. "We have arrived in the epoch of the Anthropocene, where the appropriation of the world through human pollution moves from a subjective and organic marking of contested territory to an objective series of claims that operate preventatively. The human is the occupier of the earth most especially by way of destroying it so thoroughly that no other species can survive in proximity to our, that is, human waste. And so if the first act of appropriation is through piss or shit as a territorial sign made through bodily expulsions, we need to ask, with Michel Serres again, quote, how does the physiological change into brute matter and vital excrement become chemical waste. For Serres, this is an aspect of manufactured objects. He gives the examples of how clothing derives from hair and skin, but replaces them, how hammers struggle out of the forearm and the fist, how the wheel imitates joints, ankles, and hips. And then he says that these appliances rig out the organs of our bodies. Michel Serres calls the appliance-driven outrigging of the body exo-Darwinism, to say outside of the body, to characterize it as an evolving processual dynamic that occurs alongside the biological evolution of species, but according to its own rhythm. Exo-Darwinism would be one term we could use. I, in my own work in writing about the philosophy of the Anthropocene, follow Manuel DeLanda, who calls the process mineralization. And so if you look at the two images on the screen, the first great mineralization took place historically in this period called the Ediacaran, which is when animals that used to be sort of like fleshy, soft, like meat plants, started to appropriate salts and minerals from the ocean and turn themselves into creatures with bones, teeth, claws, and introduce predation into the environment. Of course, this took place over hundreds of millions of years. Mineralization can also happen outside of the body in the case of, for example, the production of steel or an exoskeletal mineralization in nearly every office tower, as well as all of the aspects of human transportation, building types, the mass production of goods, and the development of nearly all subsequent forms of technology. So, as you mentioned in the introduction, one of my interests is in how that process of mineralization has come to mean certain things for us. The question I like to ask of architecture is, why do things that are contiguous metal structures or shapes seem progressive? Why do we imagine those as being somehow a positive cultural project? It's a strange question, and it has irritated some architects, but maybe for the better. So let me just give the quickest background on the Anthropocene. I'm sure it's kind of now, at least everyone has heard something on the radio of this or some sort, but let me just give the quickest version. The International Commission on Stratigraphy and the International Union of Geologic Sciences are debating whether or not they can recognize a new geologic period that we're in, the Anthropocene. This period would begin sometime following the Holocene, the epoch that we thought we were in, since the recession of the last ice age. The term comes from the chemist Paul Crutzen, but we can sort of skip over the sort of minutiae of its arrival in contemporary culture. The thing that is interesting is that to determine whether or not the Anthropocene would satisfy the right scientific criteria, stratigraphers and geologists must consider various anthropogenic effects, the things that human beings do. These changes would include, the evidence of the Anthropocene would include, but are certainly not limited to, the rise of agriculture and attendant deforestation, coal, oil, and gas extraction, as well as the combustion of carbon-based fuels, their attendant emissions, coral reef loss, producing reef gaps, similar to those as the past 5 major extinction events, and a rate of extinction happening at tens of thousands of times faster than in most of the last 500 million years. All very positive criteria. Of course, the most significant thing about this question of the Anthropocene is the rate of human propagation. Here we are again. According to the biologist E.O. Wilson, population growth for human beings is more bacterial than primate. From the point of view of geology, though, there's a sort of obvious problem for any of you who have ever seen rocks, which I assume is most of you, is that they tend to take a really long time to get made. That's why they're so hard. That's my science moment. So why are rocks so hard? Because they take a long time to get made. So what would be the problem then is that from a geologic perspective, you can't tell the criteria of a geologic period because we're not even in the process of sedimentation yet. We're still eroding the surface of the earth. We're still mineralizing by bringing minerals from the subsurface to the surface and breaking them up and turning them into all of the things that we use. So there is introduced in geology at this moment, which I think is really the most interesting component of the Anthropocene, a speculative dimension. And this speculative dimension makes us think about objects that, as Michel Serres says, objects are merely flames frozen by different time scales. And so how we can begin to think of the processes which produce the objects and the cultures that attend to those objects is where I think the question of art and aesthetics arrives. But what about the object of the world? There are several ways that the Anthropocene is described in popular media, and I want to kind of move through this quickly, but whether it's the World Wildlife Fund saying, okay, we need another Earth, we just need one or two more, maybe. The Anthropocene has been described also as humans give Earth facelift, which I find also incredibly humorous and sad. But the Earth, when it's seen as an object of measurement, is a measurement of the impact of humans. So in order to be able to tell the story of Jimmy Durham traveling through time to prehistoric Lascaux, we need to understand one more thing, and that is human impact. So how would we start to imagine what human impact looks like? We would have to consider three key things. How do we know what it is that we're doing here on Earth? Human impact would consider, first, population. Everyone is familiar with the asymptotic curve that characterizes nearly everything that we measure following the Second World War. The second impact would be technology, and particularly the patenting of technology and its explosion. These are criteria used by the UN. I'm not making them up. And the third impact is a question of affluence. So when even primates are drinking bottled water, we know that affluence is spreading quite rigorously. So in this image, it's okay on this screen. This is actually just taken from National Geographic. Unfortunately, I didn't realize we cut off the top. But what you get is population, affluence, technology as the equation that should be an equal sign of human impact. I equals P times A times T, or IPAT is how it's referred to in the UN literature on measuring human impacts. The important thing to notice is that from here, in 1900, we have this volume if we consider those three factors. If we just look at the 1900 to the 2011, you get a sense of order of magnitude increases in the number of issues related to impact. I work on those in two ways. One way is that I work with Farid Raccoon, who's working with myself and Professor Meredith Miller on a project called Architecture and Adaptation, where we look at issues of coastal inundation and extreme pollution and urban poverty in Southeast Asia. These are both images from the Wadak Pluit neighborhood in Jakarta, where we were working together this summer and where we were returning in May to continue that research. And this is one place where I think Anthropocene research, we can leverage that in a particular way, but I just want to put it in the context tonight. I just want to mention that because it's an important component of the work. But what I want to talk about is the role of the Anthropocene as a kind of aesthetic, and the Anthropocene as seen through the history of art. And so, of course, to understand nature and human relations in the history of art, we turn to the depiction of women. So this, of course, is the female personification of America, otherwise known as Colombia. You can tell because she's got all of the telephone wires wrapped around her arm. I don't know actually I think you can tell by the star on her forehead. And you'll notice that in John Gass' painting from 1872 of American Progress, Colombia's dragging out the mineralization. She's got the telephone wires, the railroad is running behind her, and we're in fact delivering some urban renewal in reverse to the unsettled West. We'll come back to this question of settler culture as we talk about Jimmy Durham in a moment, but I just want to note, okay, so first image, Anthropocene carried by female personification, progress as stringing out the metal. The second image, no less provocative, is from the sculptor Louis Barrias. This is actually turn of the century, 1899. Many of you will recognize this figure as Isis from the emerald brooch that is seen here. And this, of course, is titled Nature Revealing Herself Before Science. This is really an important moment because prior to this artistic depiction of nature before 1899, we could have never imagined looking at Isis in the face, let alone topless, so to speak, because if you were to look at nature directly, you would die. Everyone knows if you look Isis in the face, you die. And so the question of, by the turn of the century, how is it that nature is not only now accessible to us, but in fact sort of prompting us in some form of seduction where there is a relationship of unveiling herself before science as if it's active on the part of nature. So nature gains some agency. Nature is somehow, though, complicit in all of the scientific motives for its investigation. The third image, which is the one where we will return to Serres, is, of course, from Goya slightly earlier in the early 1820s. But this is a favorite image of Michel Serres because he uses this to describe the fact that while human beings attack one another with their outrigged appliances here from the title, Fight with Cudgels, the fact is that they're actually sinking into the mud. And so for Serres, this is the key image to understand the Anthropocene. For exo-Darwinian evolution is the use of tools of human beings attacking each other. While these appliances allow us to annihilate each other, what they actually mean is that we're swallowed by a nature which is equally hostile to us, and hostile to us no less because of many of the technologies and appliances that we have developed. So is there another way to think about this aesthetically in a more contemporary context? And I would submit to you that the way to think about it is through the work of Jimmy Durham. I'm not an art historian or a critic. I'm a philosopher who really likes art and sometimes architecture, but mostly art. And what I really find incredibly compelling in my research on Jimmy Durham's work and writing and production over the last 40 years is that he doubts culture, and he doubts culture in a way that anticipates cave painting in Lascaux. And the reason he does this is because, well, let me explain why. So, you can all, in your mind, close your eyes and imagine like a cave painting, right? Like a sort of loosely figural, iterative series of animals and humans in the way that we would imagine it. These paintings, for two thinkers who have been very influential on me, André Leroy-Gorin and Georges Bataille, were so incredibly intense moments of speculation because prehistoric painting, Paleolithic cave painting, for both of them was a relationship between techniques, okay, actually making the painting, and an aesthetic ambition, which was not about simply articulating some previous force. If a hammer is the extension of the fist, the paintbrush is not an extension of a previous question. Of course, this comes up in a number of ways. Bataille's argument is that, in fact, cave painting retraces the way that bears would scratch their claws on the caves to sharpen them, and that the attempt to paint that for Bataille, and this is really the crux of the argument, is that art and religion in Paleolithic culture for Bataille are ways of trying to return to the immanence that human beings are losing by the very fact of becoming cultural. Okay? Art and religion for Bataille function as ritual activities performed to create events that signal the loss of immanence of the human as such. This is an incredibly complicated argument in the sense that it's entirely speculative and entirely impossible to prove. But what's fascinating then is when we look to cave painting, when we look to Paleolithic culture, why do we imagine that we can see ourselves there? Why is it that the human disguises itself, whether it is in the aping of the bear's activities, to mix metaphors, or as a way of articulating some connection to a lost immanence? I think that this question of culture as a negotiation of immanence, as it was taken up in Lascaux, is exactly why Jimmy Durham was attracted to the site. The detail of his passage from his role as a Cherokee activist, poet, and artist, as many of you will know, until 1980, Jimmy Durham was the director of the International Indian Treaty Council and a member of the American Indian Movement Central Committee, to his residency in prehistoric Lascaux merits more consideration than this lecture can permit me. But we will say presently that the journey is one of formidable speculative intensity. It fosters an erratic engagement with the technologies of outrigging that Michel Serres described above. In his book on prehistoric apprenticeship, and for those of you familiar with his work, you'll notice that this is a recurrent question, Jimmy Durham describes how our lack of attention to everyday things results not, as some people would have it, from an underestimation of the agency of those things, but instead from the urgency of narratives that construct our feelings of social responsibility. He says this: most of the time, you're not careful with everyday things. Pardon my saying so, but it's a bit like lack of integrity to ignore the integrity of these things. He continues, I quote again, "What I mean is simply this, that the pressures upon you by a very inclusive state narrative mitigates against the fondling of the page, which after all you hold manually with your marvelously dexterous fingers and read the words printed hereon with your beautifully constructed delicate eyes, and remembering the myriad political histories involved from growing tree to pulp factory. You say you cannot possibly take the time to ponder those histories and qualities of every single little thing you might bump into, sit on, drink from, etc., during a typical busy day during which you have real social responsibility." End quote. From this perspective, involuntary participation in the social milieu operates as an alibi for the avoidance of the banal, ponderous thoughts of everyday objects. But for Jimmy Durham, the value of expending this mental energy, which is curiously embarrassing for most of us because we want to pretend to be focused, patient, productive individuals, is to the contemplative investigation of everyday things. This is not a turn toward things, but, as Jimmy Durham explains, toward the unavoidable complicity between things and human actors. The next series of images are all taken from the book, The Second Particle Wave Theory, which Durham performed in Sunderland on the Weir River. Just to give you'll see it in the images, but it involves the production of a boat put into the Weir River, loaded with this particular boulder, which he has painted in the image of, say, man, I don't know, woman, depends how you read the lips, I guess. And then the boat is left as the tide comes up in the river. Well, you'll see what happens. Some might expect that during his residency in Lascaux, it was Jimmy Durham who gained some imagined secrets from prehistoric art. But this visit was actually an exemplary case of what is known today as reverse plagiarism. It is the prehistoric cave artists who, in their engagement with Jimmy Durham, were provoked into realizing that culture is a form of integrity. Far from the enthusiasm for the same that characterizes fearful conservative cultural politics, the apprenticeship in Lascaux relieved the artists of two decisive lessons regarding culture. I recount them now. First, cultural struggles are struggles for self-determination. Second, self-determination is not at all a process of remaining the same, but is instead entirely caught up with the entangled complicities of material life, and as such, it comprises a rhythm of transformation and of change. This is not least because we, humans, are never entirely in control of the technologies through which we learn, express ourselves, and transform our environments. To quote Durham once more, "So where is your so-called personal autonomy then, Mr. or Mrs. Bigshot?" Of the many lessons imparted during the residency in Lascaux, Jimmy Durham's explication of the relationship between culture and revolutionary struggle is perhaps the most consequential. In essence, much of the residency was spent retelling the story of the arrogance of the Native American Support Committee, who, in the early 1970s, attempted to impart their allegedly revolutionary wisdom in one of two ways. First, by romanticizing Native American nations as, quote, noble savages, or second, by infantilizing them as, quote, primitives in need of Marxist guidance. In either case, what was necessary to explain was that the cultures of solidarity that emerged around Native American political struggles in America tended to reiterate reactionary values of a predatory settler nation. Let us recount what Jimmy Durham explained as an explanation to ourselves of the relationship between objects and settler cultures. Quote, "Our societies, our culture define us. In a large part, and our way of experiencing the world is through culture. Politics, economics, science, and technology, language are all cultural phenomena. Finally, of course, so are political phenomena. And I'm saying that many progressive people in this country, referring back to America, particularly many whites and many blacks, are not critically conscious of that process and are part of mass society in one degree or another. Because of this," he says, "we have always defined our struggle," speaking here of the Cherokee Nation, "not only as a struggle for land, but also as a struggle to retain our cultural values. The struggle to maintain culture is itself a revolutionary struggle. It is a dynamic and positive struggle, not a passive holding action. The traditions we mean are not exterior manifestations that are easily identified as Indian, not the artifacts and objects of our culture, but what we call our vision, the value system that makes our culture. In short, we mean a political system, but remember that we have been taught a very special vocabulary, a settler vocabulary. We mean a political system and not our well-made arrowheads." End quote. To help the prehistoric cave artists understand the stakes of these relations, especially the relationship between form and force, or artifact and politics, Jimmy Durham explained the cultural dynamics of contact between the Cherokee Nation, and the settlers. He explains it like this. When the Cherokee Nation first came into contact with the settler regime, we were impressed by their iron tools. We became the blacksmiths and knife makers of the South soon after. We didn't, and don't, stop to think whether or not ironworking was a valid Cherokee or Indian activity. By taking new ideas that are useful is a very Cherokee activity. It is a very Lakota or Mohawk activity. We took glass beads, horses, wool blankets, wheat flour for fry bread, etc. very early, and we immediately made of them identifiable Indian things. We are able to do that because of our cultural integrity and because our societies are dynamic and able to take on new ideas. Since the 1840s, and especially recently, it is obviously a very Indian thing to use the best and most modern rifles available to us. One of our valued traditions is to use the best possible weapons to fight our oppressors. Jimmy Durham explained the importance of thinking about cultural struggles not merely through the reductive evidence of objects and artifacts, but through the adaptive capacities that such objects allow and demand. This is why painting on rocks as a form of expression that challenges by doubting the progressive stride of our technological appliances is not properly a prehistoric aesthetic form. It is also a form used as a contemporary weapon in the aesthetic and artistic practices of Jimmy Durham. Jimmy Durham's painting isn't quite figurative. It's more comedic and ruthlessly. His childlike smiley faces are painted with careful attention on the surface of boulders, which are then dropped by industrial cranes on the various appliances of outrigged human activity, especially cars, airplanes, and boats. If our outrigged hypermobility is an exo-Darwinian technology in the sense that Saris described it above, then I would argue that Jimmy Durham is in fact a hyper-scruple. His smiling boulders crush our most familiar technological appliances and vex our hope for belonging to these not-so-eternal objects. But who is the protagonist in this event of aesthetic and artistic dispossession? Is it the rock absolved of its inorganic stasis by a comedic face? Is it the automobility of the contemporary user of cars, airplanes, or boats, crushed under the weight of geologic proportion? Or could these comedic inversions undo our ability to think the protagonist in a traditional sense altogether? To respond to these questions, I first want to remind everyone that the technological outrigging that Saris described was always related to an instrumentality, a wheel to a joint, a hammer to a fist. Our concern is with aesthetic expression, artistic production, that does not refer back to any prior utility or necessity. For example, a portrait of the artist as a stone sculpture. With this in mind, we're going to go back to the cave one more time. This time with the German director Werner Herzog, where we can begin to see the continua of human endeavors start to splinter. Like many of Jimmy Durham's sculptures, Werner Herzog's recent 3D film, Cave of Forgotten Dreams from 2010, most of you, I'm sure, maybe have seen it now, provides an exemplary retaliation on any viewer in search of a human protagonist. Throughout the film, Herzog allows us to develop a certain intuitive connection with the prehistoric artists of the Chauvet Cave, which is the Chauvet Cave, I believe, is about 15,000 years prior to the Lascaux Cave, which Bataille and Leroy Gorin write about. And as an aside, so it's between 35,000 years, the oldest known Paleolithic cave. Herzog assembles his documentary as a series of archaeological, anthropological, and museological evidence that tempts us to project a continuity between our contemporary human culture and the emergent culture of cave painting and music making in Chauvet. We are even tempted with the technological apparatus of a vast 3D map of the cave from millions and millions of points. They produce a perfect map of Chauvet, as if mapping the cave would somehow let us know what the images meant and what our relationship to them is. Herzog's cruel laughter, of course you can all imagine his haunting German laughing at you, concludes the film in the postscript when he travels up the river from the cave to a French nuclear power station where the hot water from the plant's cooling system is diverted into a biodome for young albino crocodiles. This is true. It's a spoiler, but it's true. As the image of the thriving young albino crocodiles living on the hot water of a nuclear power plant begins to break apart, and the multiplying reflections of water and glass completely scramble the image, Herzog concludes the film sardonically asking if this nuclear-powered crocodile should also claim its origin myth in the caves of Chauvet. Since we can't find our reflections in the cave, we are also freed from the self-assuring myths that such cultural mirrors afford us. Perhaps in losing mythic affirmation of our common humanity, or the hubris of some cultural mission, or the telos or ending of some properly human thing that we're supposed to be doing here, we, the humans of the Anthropocene, are afforded a rhythm of self-determination that does not fear complicity and contingency, but instead finds its integrity through these entanglements. This is why Jimmy Durham explains the etymology of the term scruple. To be scrupulous, he says, is to have scruples. Originally, a scruple was a small stone in one's shoe. It made it more difficult to stride forward in confidence. It made people more hesitant. It is not that people placed stones in their shoes deliberately, simply that there were more scruples in the world in those days. In his second particle wave theory, Durham says that he is in fact not even an artist, but an epirogenist, and that he has been practicing epirogeny for over 40 years. In geology, epirogeny is the broad upwarp of cratonic proportions of the continents, which takes place over broad nonlinear areas, is incredibly slow and results in very mild deformations of the land. To sustain in the contemporary world the productive doubt, the scrupulous doubt that constituted the emergent culture of Lascaux, doubting itself, doubting its lack of imminence to the world, Jimmy Durham's scruples indeed have increased in scale, crushing appliances like cars and planes while bearing the painterly comedy of a human smiley face. Is the culture of contemporary art today capable of taking up this idea? that every human protagonist is in fact entangled in a mess of material complicities, but that the politics of human culture, of settler culture, and of human struggle must also be confronted, even when they are so materially entangled? Artists today can answer this question quite simply by placing a rock in their shoe and walking around for a few days and thinking about the role of art in relation to cultural struggle. You may be surprised by your unavowable but undeniable commitment to human politics and the laughter it provokes in you when you finally decide to remove the intolerable smiling rock from your shoe scrupulously. Thank you. So I think we have the room till 7, something. If you guys have questions, that would be nice. I said, I'm trying to work out this question of things, and it's kind of to the side, but I know I kind of veer in the number of constellations, so I'm happy to take your questions or attacks as they come, Really?
Okay, so I'm trying to sort out what your take on the thingness is of things.
Okay, me too.
Okay, so there's the various entanglements of how those things, the histories of their making or whatever, and that's significant. Our ability to think about them is one of the things which you sort of hold up as being exemplary of, the processes that are maybe different from simple, like, tool usage.
Right.
You talk about, like, the various apparatuses and how they just extended our physical abilities. And so, are thinking about things now, are you seeing that in a positive way, or are you critiquing the lack of thought? I'm trying to get your direction on those other conversations.
Okay, so there's a philosophical conversation that goes something like this, that we can find a more ethical and more appropriate contemporary comportment to the world by trying to remove human agency from the question. We have an anthropocentric view. We think things according to the human. So let's try to develop a non-anthropocentric philosophy based on objects that would look at the properties of those things and not concern itself with human projections and human concerns. Okay? The problem that I have with this move, and the reason why I think Jimmy Durham's work is so exemplary, both in his early writing during his time at AIM, his early writing about culture and settler culture, is that there are no objects in the world worth considering without considering their relationship to human culture, because that's where our struggles take place, that's where our politics are. And so in a way it's trying to say, bracketing off objects as a way to get to non-anthropocentric thinking is in a way cutting off your hand because you hurt your finger. It's saying, why are we trying to keep ourselves away from questions of politics by not accepting the fact, especially right now, after, as I said at the beginning, in a time when the consequences of the things we do are becoming more and more clear at the scale of the planet. My friend Tom Cohen has produced an incredible book called Telomorphosis. Okay, and that tele means distance. And what Tom's saying is that we're in a period in the Anthropocene where the distance in both time and space that we used to have from our actions to their consequences is becoming incredibly foreshortened, right? So that both when we could collude and it would go away, and it would go away in time and in space, we don't have that same affordance of distance. So this telemorphosis is a bringing to the foreground of those consequences. I think in a time like that, it's not to say don't look at cultural artifacts, but the question of their primacy and priority is something that I think just seeing a number of people take up the thing, power, object orientation is politically reactionary. Yeah. Instead of maybe it's on tape now. Do you guys want to go back to the pile of the rocks of America? Because I also just, if anyone wants to explain to me why that exists, I was like, I'm going to start with this image because I stare at it all day long. But if anyone wants to tell me an hour later what this means in like a cultural way, if it's like good or bad, or like the most avant-garde thing you've ever seen in your life, we can talk about that too. Everyone's tired, ready for reviews. Look how we have to deal with this guy all week now. He's going to be on a reviews. Yeah.
I mean, I had not familiar with Jimmy Durham's work before this lecture, so I'm only picturing these like acts of dropping giant boulders, smiley faces on like maybe outdated or what is it, like modes of human transportation? It's like cars.
Typically, cars and
I mean,
planes.
that sounds like pretty overtly political work in my mind, and I'm just wondering if you could talk more about what you imagine the artist's like role in culture is. Is it like, I mean, as like, is it political? I mean,
Sure. I mean, I think one of the reasons why I think he is such an interesting figure, I should say one of the reasons I was able to do this work is because in the Joseph Labadie Special Collections Archive at the University of Michigan, they have a bunch of Jimmy Durham's writing from the American Indian movement. So it's not hard to get, but it's not easily accessible. And so there's a relationship between his articulation of culture as a thing which is able to adapt according to different conceptions of utility. That identity is not caught up with the identity of my culture means I have this thing. It's that a cultural practice, as he describes it, is something that allows us to change, which is why I think art as a cultural and political practice is so important, because it challenges, it asks questions of society that society won't ask itself. Let's say that. And so, which this does so well that I don't even know what questions it's asking. but in the context of Jimmy Durham, like you put a huge boulder, you like gently place it as it crushes a car, and then you like paint a funny face on it, and it's like, there you go. And people say, you're a bad artist, you can't draw, you can't, this is just like gimmicky thing, and he says, yeah, I'm a pyrogenist. I just move rocks around to make minimal deformations in the landscape of art. And so he's claiming a geologic line, he's claiming a cultural line. I think, there's no way to see that. I kind of didn't want to just show like a bunch of smashed planes because there is a way I'm trying to hold it back a little bit. But yeah, is smashing a boulder into an airplane a political statement? And yes, but is it a better political statement if you put a smiley face on it? Yes. And that's the relationship I think that's important. The culture, it can be ways of humorously dealing with things that are intolerable. Not necessarily, like Foucault's famous lines, we do not need to be sad in order to be militant. There's a humor in dealing with how bad our culture is at adapting. how bad settler culture is at adapting is funny. And so if we can maybe use art to laugh at that a bit, it could loosen up ways of changing it a little bit more, maybe at a better rhythm, or at a more interesting rhythm than one that would lead to, say, extinction on one end, or the reification of political inequality on another end, or those two things together. So.
I kind of want to ask about something, but I'm not. Okay, so this isn't fully formulated.
Okay.
Bear with me. I'm interested in. So I've been thinking about the asymptote.
Right.
How we're living in the asymptote, and we're going through completely. We're heading towards something completely unknowable, mostly as a result of, what you prefer to call mineralization.
Right. Yeah.
So you established that the history of art, its genesis being something which was singular aside from other types of mineralization, and that it has no previous analog.
Right.
Right. I'm wondering if it retains, if we can imagine that it will retain that special place through the asymptote. I'm wondering how it's going to play out differently as culture progresses in completely unpredictable ways. So I'm asking you to predict the unpredictable. And
Okay, of course. That's why I'm here. Predict unpredictable. Okay. There's two ways that I teach this image when I teach it, and let's do them both. Okay. So one way, and it's always with architects. So pardon how much I dumb it down. If this is where, we have this little box right here, Beaux-Arts, maybe like Corb is like a baby, and like Frank Lloyd Wright saw his first waterfall right here, and now these things. And so it's like, all of architectural education is in this box, pretty much. I mean, we get like from Las Vegas, the next most significant thing right here. And so if all of your education comes from this little box, and this is the context you're in now, by the law of order of magnitude increase that architects understand very well, that box is totally useless for that big box. The example from Canada that I will share with you is that if I build a beautiful igloo for my friends, and we have a little party in it, and it's great. But I cannot have a football game in my igloo because order of magnitude increases change the relationships between the materials and the properties. So as to say that the things that we learn here are no fucking way going to help us with this. And so that's one way of saying it for your question. The other way would be to say that really it all comes out of this box. So if we really understand this box, then we can basically get the parameters of the explosion, or we start to understand the asymptote curve differently. But to answer the unpredictable, I bet both things at the same time, because I did a history of steel around the 1900s, and I do the future of urbanism. So I'm trying to play on both teams, as it were. But I think the question of art in the relationship between Glasgow to the present is that the artist is the person who is capable of asking questions, of having doubts, of being a scruple in the shoe of society in a way that is a very special position. And so will that continue to be the case? On the curve, of course, there's art and art world and art market and everything. But it's also a great alibi. If you tell someone you're doing art, then they totally leave you alone all the time. So, most of you have figured this out, right? That's why you're getting these degrees. So okay, then, it's just an art project. Don't even worry about it. And then you're doing other things. It's cultural struggle. It's a political practice. It's trying to deal with the complexities of settler culture and of environmental collapse and other issues. But you know, you're an artist, so you're allowed to do it in improbable ways, and not always head on. You know, so then that's a good. That's, you know, why not be the artist then? Yeah. That's okay. Yeah. Okay. Freeze ready to eat. So can I just say, like, I'm gonna maybe see a bunch of you at some time, but I'm like around until Tuesday. Like I brought a big suitcase, and so. But if you want to talk about any of these things, and whether I'm with your review or not, just like let me know, or like I'll be around. Yeah. Thanks, guys.